When an empath goes quiet, it's already over. Sighs. There is a precise moment in human interactions that most people misread entirely. It is not the moment someone slams a door. It is not the explosive argument at 2 in the morning, nor is it the tearful ultimatum where voices rise and emotions boil over. Those moments, loud, chaotic, and distressing as they are, actually carry a hidden signal. There is still hope. When a person raises their voice, when they plead, analyze, explain, or demand to be understood, they are still making a massive withdrawal from their own emotional bank account to invest in the relationship. Thoughtful. They are fighting because they still believe the bridge can hold. They are expending cognitive and emotional capital in the hope of reaching mutual understanding. The true point of no return looks completely different. It is utterly, terrifyingly silent. If you have ever watched someone who used to care deeply, someone who felt every nuance of your mood, who analyzed every unspoken shift in the room, who gave endlessly of their presence, suddenly drop into a quiet, calm stillness, you have witnessed a profound shift in human neuroscience. Most people mistake this quiet for a phase. They think they just need space, or they're playing mind games, or they'll calm down and bring it up tomorrow. They because when a deeply empathetic human being goes completely silent, they haven't stepped back to think, they have finished thinking. They haven't stopped talking because they're confused. They've stopped talking because they've reached ultimate, razor-sharp clarity. The brain has made a calculated decision to cut its losses. The neural bandwidth that was once dedicated to understanding you, fixing the friction, and maintaining emotional safety has been reallocated entirely to self-preservation. If you are listening to this right now, whether you are the person who has gone quiet, or you are the one staring into the sudden, cool silence of someone you thought would always be there, you need to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. Why does this quiet feel so heavy? Why does it feel so permanent? And why is it that by the time you finally notice the silence, it is already over? To understand this is to understand the core architecture of human connection, emotional self-regulation, and the hidden limit of empathy. Let us examine what really happens inside the human mind when an empath goes quiet. The silence of an empath is not a passive-aggressive tactic, a play for control, or an emotional manipulation strategy. It is the natural threshold reached when the nervous system enters an act of self-preservation due to chronic emotional overload. High emotional sensitivity without reciprocal emotional safety leads to a systematic drain on neural resources. The empath does not stop communicating out of anger. They stop because the brain recognizes that further expenditure yields zero ROI, return on investment. Long before physical distance or formal endings occur, an empath processes the loss of the relationship's potential internally. By the time quiet sets in, the emotional processing and the accompanying grief has already concluded. True emotional intelligence involves self-regulation. When an empath realizes their efforts to bridge emotional gaps are unreciprocated, their focus shifts from co-regulating the relationship to regulating their own internal peace through detachment. Unlike reactive outbursts, which indicate a desire to stay and fix things, quiet finality marks total emotional completion. Once this quiet boundary is established, it is almost entirely irreversible because it stems from clarity, not conflict. The silence of an empath is not a passive-aggressive tactic, a play for control, or an emotional manipulation strategy. It is the natural threshold reached when the nervous system enters an act of self-preservation due to chronic emotional overload. In human dynamics, silence is frequently misunderstood as a weapon, a cold shoulder applied deliberately to punish, provoke anxiety, or force a partner into compliance. However, viewing an empath's quiet through this transactional lens completely misinterprets the underlying neuroscience and psychological realities at play. When a person with high emotional sensitivity stops speaking, negotiating, and reaching out, they are not executing a calculated tactical maneuver designed to alter another person's behavior. Instead, they have crossed an involuntary physiological line where their neural and emotional architecture can no longer sustain the continuous expenditure of unreciprocated energy. To understand this quiet, one must look at how the empathic brain operates under prolonged emotional strain. Highly empathetic individuals possess neural pathways that are hyper-attuned to social cues, micro-expressions, and the emotional states of those around them. This intrinsic sensitivity means that relational friction, unresolved conflict, and atmospheric tension are not merely observed. They are felt as direct physical and psychological stress. When an empath attempts to resolve these issues over time, they engage in an intense form of cognitive and emotional labor. They speak up, analyze dynamics, seek common ground, and offer relentless clarity in an effort to restore harmony and safety to the environment. Every conversation, explanation, and gentle confrontation requires a massive withdrawal of bandwidth from their internal bank account. When these attempts at co-regulation are repeatedly met with dismissiveness, defensive hostility, or indifference, the body's autonomic nervous system takes over. The human brain cannot maintain a state of heightened emotional output without receiving signals of reciprocal safety and effort. Over time, the continuous exposure to unaddressed friction forces the nervous system into a state of chronic burnout. At this point, the silent response is not a conscious choice to ignore someone. It is a profound neurological shutdown. The prefrontal cortex, which governs active communication and problem-solving, recognizes that further expenditure yields a zero return on investment. The silence that follows is the somatic manifestation of absolute exhaustion. It represents the precise boundary where the body transitions from trying to fix the external bond to fiercely preserving internal survival. This distinction between deliberate retaliation and biological self-preservation is crucial. Retaliation requires active, boiling energy. It is fed by anger, a desire for vengeance, and an underlying expectation that the other party will react. It is an outward-facing behavior designed to maintain engagement, albeit toxic engagement. The terminal silence of an empath, conversely, is entirely inward-facing. It is cool, steady, and devoid of performative anger. It carries no residual demand for a response because the desire for external validation has completely collapsed. The empath has realized that speaking further only re-traumatizes their own system without altering the relational reality. Therefore, the quiet is an act of deep self-compassion, a defensive fortress built around the remaining fragments of their cognitive peace. When this terminal point is reached, the individual is no longer fighting against the other person, nor are they trying to teach them a lesson. They are simply stepping out of the arena because their nervous system has dictated that remaining in it is a threat to their fundamental well-being. The mechanics of emotional exhaustion in an empathetic individual operate much like a continuous physical drain on finite metabolic resources. High emotional sensitivity is not merely a personality trait. It is a hypervigilant cognitive processing system that requires immense neurological fuel to sustain. When this heightened capacity to absorb, decode, and process interpersonal dynamics exists in an environment devoid of reciprocal emotional safety, a systematic depletion of internal reserves begins. Every human interaction involves a degree of emotional give and take, a reciprocal loop where vulnerable communication is met with understanding, effort, and validation. In a healthy dynamic, this loop acts as a source of energy restoration, sending signals of safety to the nervous system that reinforce connection. However, when an empath repeatedly invests high levels of emotional labor into an environment where the output is never matched, the dynamic transforms into a closed loop of net loss. The brain continually spends its cognitive and emotional capital trying to bridge gaps, soothe friction, and interpret unspoken tensions, expecting an eventual return in the form of mutual effort or resolution. When that return continuously fails to materialize, the brain's survival mechanisms begin to alter its priorities. The empath does not simply wake up one day and decide to become indifferent. Instead, a slow, methodical wear and tear occurs across the neural systems responsible for empathy, patience, and emotional regulation. Over time, the constant state of giving without receiving baseline security forces the brain to calculate the return on investment for every future interaction. In economic terms, when an asset consistently yields a loss, rational logic dictates the termination of investment to prevent total insolvency. In psychological terms, when every attempt to explain, reconcile, or seek emotional safety yields defensive pushback, apathy, or hostility, the mind reaches a state of cognitive burnout. The decision to stop communicating is therefore not born out of sudden anger, resentment, or a desire to strike back. Anger is an active, energetic emotion that signals a lingering desire to change the situation. It is an attempt to enforce a boundary so that the relationship can survive. The quiet that replaces it occurs when anger has completely burned through its fuel. The empath stops talking because their cognitive architecture recognizes that further expenditure of energy produces a 0% return on investment. Continuing to express feelings, offer feedback, or demand understanding in a deaf environment is recognized by the brain as an irrational waste of vital resources. The brain officially classifies the relational effort as a futile exercise, shifting its imperative from co-regulating the relationship to protecting what remains of the individual's psychological integrity. This systematic drain reshapes how the empath views the dynamic entirely. The realization sets in that no amount of articulate explanation, deeper patience, or gentler framing will manufacture emotional safety where none exists. The neural pathways that once fired with urgent energy to solve the problem become quiet, detached, and still. The cessation of communication is a calculated, physiological, conserve energy protocol. It is the natural mechanical consequence of prolonged, unreciprocated expenditure, marking the exact moment the brain decides to shut down an unprofitable emotional connection in order to protect its own survival. The process of internal closure for a highly empathetic person is a quiet, solitary, and profoundly structured grieving period that occurs long before any physical separation or explicit verbal ending takes place. While those around them may perceive a relationship as stable, routine, or merely experiencing a temporary rough patch, the empath is often already deep in the work of processing its ultimate collapse. Because empaths process human connection on a deeply cognitive and emotional level, they do not simply react to the sudden death of a bond. They systematically mourn its decline while still actively participating in the daily reality of the dynamic. This period of private grieving involves a methodical dismantling of hope. It begins when the empath realizes that their repeated attempts to communicate, align, and build mutual safety are hitting an unyielding wall. Instead of walking away immediately, their initial response is to retreat inward to process the reality of what is happening. They begin to mourn the loss of the relationship's potential, the idealized vision of what the connection could have been if reciprocal effort had existed. They process the quiet heartbreak of unfulfilled promises, the consistent absence of emotional depth, and the realization that their investment will never yield a secure, shared reality. This internal grieving process is exhaustive and thoroughly comprehensive. Sitting across from a partner at dinner, replying to daily messages, or maintaining domestic routines, the empath is internally cataloging every instance of emotional disconnect, feeling the weight of each one, and slowly severed their emotional dependencies. They cry their tears in private moments, work through their anger in solitude, and grapple with the profound disappointment of unrequited care, away from the view of the person sitting right next to them. By conducting this intense psychological work silently and continuously over time, the empath effectively completes the grieving cycle while still physically present. This is precisely why, when the final silence descends, it appears so sudden, cold, and absolute to the outside observer. To the partner or friend, it seems as though a switch was flipped overnight. In reality, that switch was the culmination of a long, painful, and fully realized mourning process that has finally reached its natural conclusion. By the time the empath goes completely quiet, they have no remaining tears to shed, no lingering arguments to make, and no hidden reserves of grief left to process. The emotional work is entirely finished. The sadness has been fully metabolized, leaving behind a clear, unshakable state of acceptance. This internal completion fundamentally alters the nature of the quiet that follows. The silence is not a cry for help, an invitation for negotiation, or a sign of lingering inner conflict. It is the steady, cool atmosphere that remains after a storm has entirely passed. The empath has already asked all the hard questions, confronted their deepest fears about letting go, and adjusted to the reality of the loss within the privacy of their own mind. Because the emotional detachment was forged through exhaustive internal processing rather than an impulsive reaction, the quiet carries an extraordinary weight of finality. The grief has been lived through, accepted, and cleared away, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding reality that the connection has officially reached its end. The paradigm shift from active emotional regulation to total detachment represents a profound evolution in how a highly empathetic individual manages interpersonal stress. At the core of high emotional intelligence lies the drive to co-regulate, to use one's awareness, communication, and emotional capacity to bridge gaps, soothe friction, and establish a state of mutual safety within a relationship. When relational distress arises, an empath's immediate instinct is to step into the dynamic and regulate it. They apply patience, initiate difficult conversations, offer grace, and adjust their own behavior in an ongoing effort to maintain harmony and protect the bond. This continuous effort to co-regulate is driven by a deep belief in the transformative power of empathy and mutual understanding. However, co-regulation is an inherently collaborative process. It requires two participants who are equally committed to self-awareness, vulnerability, and reciprocal effort. When an empath repeatedly brings their emotional bandwidth to a dynamic only to encounter stonewalling, defensiveness, indifference, or emotional evasion, the fundamental utility of co-regulation breaks down. The mind begins to recognize that pouring energy into stabilizing a two-sided connection is entirely futile when only one person is doing the heavy lifting. This realization triggers a pivotal, irreversible cognitive shift. The empath stops attempting to regulate the shared space between two people and shifts their entire focus to regulating their own internal state. This shift is not an emotional failure, but rather a sophisticated act of self-preservation guided by high emotional intelligence. The individual recognizes that while they cannot force another person to meet them in a space of maturity and reciprocity, they maintain total authority over their own internal peace. Transitioning from co-regulation to internal regulation requires the complete withdrawal of emotional investment from the external dynamic. The empath stops trying to manage the other person's reactions, stops trying to make themselves understood, and stops trying to fix the systemic issues plaguing the connection. Instead, they erect an absolute boundary that protects their cognitive and emotional resources from further exposure to unreciprocated demands. Detachment becomes the primary mechanism through which self-regulation is achieved. By detaching their sense of peace from the status or success of the relationship, the empath neutralizes the toxic stress caused by constant, unresolved conflict. The quiet that emerges from this shift is fundamentally different from a temporary retreat or an emotional shutdown designed to cool off before the next attempt at resolution. It is a permanent recalibration of priority. The empath has effectively decided that their limited energy is better spent maintaining their own mental clarity, physical well-being, and internal balance than attempting to repair a connection that consistently dismantles those very things. The focus turns entirely inward. They are no longer seeking validation, harmony, or safety from an external source that has proven incapable of providing it. Through this deliberate shift to internal self-regulation, the empath reclaims their autonomy. The quiet is the physical boundary of that newly reclaimed space, a serene, unshakable atmosphere where their energy is finally preserved for their own stability rather than wasted on a relational dynamic that offers no functional return. The distinction between reactive, dramatic emotional outbursts and the quiet finality of an empath reaching their absolute boundary lies in the underlying psychological intent of the behavior. High conflict moments, arguments characterized by raised voices, tearful ultimatums, passionate debates, or dramatic exits are rarely true endings. From a psychological perspective, dynamic conflict carries an implicit investment. It signals that an individual still believes the relationship contains something worth fighting for. The emotional energy, volatility, and desire to make oneself understood demonstrate a lingering expectation that the other person might hear them, understand their pain, and change the trajectory of the dynamic. Drama, as exhausting as it may be, is an active attempt to alter reality and force a resolution. It is a desperate bid for connection and understanding disguised as conflict. When an empath reaches the terminal stage of detachment, however, all desire to alter the other person's behavior or force a resolution has completely evaporated. The explosive energy of frustration gives way to a profound, unshakable calm. This transition marks the arrival of true finality without drama. There are no slammed doors, no sweeping proclamations of grief, no passive-aggressive jabs, and no long manifestos detailing where things went wrong. The empath simply stops engaging in the back-and-forth cycle altogether. This absence of theatrical conflict is often deeply confusing to those on the receiving end, who mistake the lack of anger for peace, compliance, or a signal that the storm has passed and things can return to normal. In truth, the absence of anger is the most dangerous sign of all. Anger requires care, hope, and an expenditure of vital cognitive resources. Once those are gone, indifference takes its place. This quiet finality stems from absolute intellectual and emotional clarity. The empath has transcended the stage of confusion and emotional turbulence. They are no longer wrestling with the why or hoping for a different outcome because they have accepted the reality of the situation for exactly what it is. Because this boundary is built on cold, clear-eyed realization rather than a transient burst of emotional reactivity, it possesses an extraordinary, almost irreversible stability. Reactive boundaries, set in the heat of a fight, often collapse once the anger subsides and loneliness or nostalgia sets in. But a boundary established in total, quiet clarity carries no residual doubt or emotional leverage to exploit. There is no lingering desire to prove a point, win an argument, or secure an apology. Because the empath no longer requires the other person's validation or understanding to validate their own experience. They do not need to construct a dramatic exit because the real exit has already taken place within the quiet machinery of their mind. When this level of stillness sets in, the empath has successfully separated their sense of self from the outcome of the relationship. The boundary they set is not a fence built to keep the other person out of spite. It is an organic, self-contained space where their peace is preserved without compromise. Once established, this quiet boundary is virtually impossible to break, because it is rooted in the quiet, absolute realization that no further words can change what has already reached its natural and inevitable end.